In our last video, we discussed the origins of gender norms, gender divisions of labor, and specifically the origins of patriarchy in early civilizations. In this video, we're going to take a look at what that meant, how patriarchy in early civilizations played out in practice. So, we've already talked a little bit about the economic roles played by men and women, and how that division of labor contributed to a power structure that was rooted in patriarchy. And again, patriarchy is this idea that power, economic, cultural, social, and political power, rests with men in a society, as opposed to matriarchal societies in which power rests with women. So by and large, in most civilizations, patriarchy is the standard power practice. And what that meant for our early civilizations in practice was not universal. So we've talked about the economic roles. Let's talk a little bit about the social and cultural and political norms that shaped patriarchy. Number one, in most patriarchal societies, gender role was bound and defined by family relations. Women were typically dependent on their fathers and then on their husbands, depending on the stage of life. And women whose husbands died were often left in a liminal or vulnerable position. So we need to understand gender norms in the context of family, so that for women, they were first daughters and then wives, and for men, they were understood as, fathers and husbands. And that created a family dynamic, a power-structured family dynamic. So this patriarchal family life was often enforced and organized by laws. There were a number of laws that kind of codified the way that a gendered family life worked. For example, in marriage, in terms of marriage, monogamy was the standard practice, although there were exceptions. So generally speaking, monogamy became a standard practice to ensure legitimacy, to ensure protections, to ensure that the tribes functioned the way that they needed to. But there were exceptions to monogamy. So for example, in Mesopotamia, monogamy was the standard, but in cases of marriage that didn't produce a son for inheritance, sexual relations and reproduction outside of marriage was allowed. In Egypt, polygamy, or the practice of having more than one marriage, was legal, but it wasn't common. Monogamy was still the most common practice. In other civilizations like the Hebrews or the Levantine civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, it was codified in religious law. This did not mean that there wasn't a sexual double standard. So while monogamy was the standard marriage practice, marriage was by and large an economic phenomenon. It was designed to ensure protection for the family, to ensure legitimacy of the children, and to ensure the survival of the group. But there was a sexual double standard for men and women. Men were by and large allowed to have extramarital partners to engage in sexual activity, while women were not. In part, this was driven by a need to prove that children born of the marriage were legitimate, but it was also the result of some unwritten gender norms. So you do have some laws, like marital laws and inheritance laws, that structure gender norms. And there are a number of unwritten social norms and practices that kind of structured these societies that imposed gender norms as well. So there were, for example, commonly accepted rules for appropriate behavior, and those commonly accepted rules for appropriate behavior were very often gendered. So men and women operated under a different set of rules from each other. So, for example, in the caste system that became associated with the Indian subcontinent, women's roles were rooted in first obedience to their father and then faithful service to their husbands. So they were expected to be obedient and faithful, while men were expected to provide protection for their daughters and then their wives. This became written into Hindu concepts of dharma, so that dharma could be gender specific. In the Indian subcontinent, rape was a serious allegation, but the victim was the husband or father, not the woman herself. So sexual purity was understood within the context of a woman's family relations. Respectable women were often clearly distinguished from non-respectable women. In many societies, respectable women were those associated with only one male, either their father or their husband, whereas non-respectable women were associated with many males or many men. So these were prostitutes or slaves. In Mesopotamia, in ancient Mesopotamia, respectable women were veiled in public, while non-respectable women were forbidden from wearing the veil. So it became a clear sign of which women were playing the respectable roles and which were not. So generally speaking, these rules, these gender rules, put women into what we might define as a subservient role, although that wasn't universal. In Egypt, for example, women often had more opportunities than they did in Mesopotamia. In Egypt, women could own property, they could own slaves, they could sign contracts, they could initiate divorce, they could hold positions of power, although that was rare. They did not, or they were not veiled, either respectable or non-respectable women. And there is increasing evidence of affectionate marriages rather than entirely depending on economic unions. They would talk about affectionate marriages as the ideal marriage, and you see that resulting from poetry or sculpture. So as we think about gender as a structuring category, as a way of understanding the past, it's important to understand that it is useful. And the idea that gender structures society and structures civilizations is almost entirely universal. But how those gender norms structured societies is not at all universal. And as you look at individual societies, you have to understand and study them from their own perspectives rather than trying to draw universal conclusions about what patriarchy looked like in the ancient world. Thank you.